Every time you buy a cup of coffee, or save money, or wonder why prices suddenly go up, you're actually participating in something much bigger than you think, the global economy. But here's the interesting part. The way we understand the economy concept today didn't appear overnight. It's the result of centuries of debate, of ideas, and of revolutionary thinkers who tried to answer one simple question. How should a society create and distribute wealth? So, hello everybody, my name is Sun An, a representative of Genius Star Business Club, and today in this video, we're going to explore the evolutionary of economic thought, where this idea began, how they changed over time, and why they still shape the decisions we make today. So let's start now. Before we dive deep into specific theories, let's take a quick look at the roadmap of today's journey through economic thought. First, we're gonna travel back to the 18th century, a time shaped by the Enlightenment. During this period, the dominant system was mercantilism, until a revolutionary thinker, Adam Smith, fundamentally changed how people understood market and wealth. And next, we move on to the 19th century, where economics began to develop more precise way to understand individual choices and market behavior. And this period includes the marginal revolution and ideas such as Say's law, which laid foundations for classical economic thinking. And finally, we're gonna explore the Marxist critics, where Karl Marx examined the darker consequences of industrial capitalism and introduced influential concepts of his work called Das Kapital. Together, these three phases show how economic ideas evolve in response to the changing world. And let's move on to the first phase. To understand how modern economics begin, we need to look at the system that dominated before 1776, which is called mercantilism. Actually, the main idea is quite simple. A country was considered wealthy if it had a large amount of gold and silver. Because of this, governments always tried to export as many goods as possible while importing was as little as possible so that more and more money would flow into their country. With this way of thinking, also treat the trade as zero-sum game, which is shown over here. In other words, if one country get wealth, another country had to lose it. And nations were essentially competing with each other for a limited amount of wealth. To achieve this, the governments adopted strong protectionist policies. They imposed very high tariffs on imported goods and restricted foreign trade, and used their colony as mainly sources of raw materials to support their own industries. And a very good example of this is shown on the right corner of the slide, which is over here, which is called the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and Americas, which connected manufactured goods, raw materials, and labor across Atlantic. However, over time, many thinkers began to question whether national wealth should really be measured only by gold and silver, and this debate eventually opened the door for a new perspective introduced by Adam Smith. So here it is. Smith introduced a very powerful concept called the invisible hand. Actually, the idea is quite intuitive. Smith argued that when individuals pursue their own self-interest, they can unintentionally benefit society as a whole. Instead of governments controlling every part of the economy, markets should organize themselves through competition. For example, imagine someone opening a bakery. Their main goal is to make profit, right? But not necessarily to help the society. But in order to attract customers, they must bake better bread, offer fair prices, and bake more and more bread to help improve their service. As more bakeries compete with each other like that, prices tend to fall and quality improve, which benefits the customer. In this way, markets work as if guided by an invisible hand like the photo shown here, coordinating millions of individual decisions without a central planner. This idea marked a major shift away from mercantilism and laid the intellectual foundation for modern free market economists. Building on the idea of the invisible hand, Adam Smith also argued for a principle called laissez-faire. I'm not sure if I'm reading it right, but in English, it literally means let it be or hands off. The idea is that the market will work best when the government does not interfere too much, when individuals and businesses are free to make their own decisions, like what to produce, how to produce it, and what price to charge. the market can naturally adjust through competition and supply and demand. Smith believed that heavily government-controlled, such as monopolies or very high tariffs, could actually distort the natural balance of the market and reduce the overall prosperity. And one another key that he introduced was the division of labor. In other words, it is the specialization. To explain this, instead of one doing everything, the production is divided into smaller tasks and each worker focuses on one specific job. For example, in a factory producing phones, there will be one group designs the software, and another group assembles the hardware, and another handles the quality checks. Because each group specializes, they become faster and more efficient, which increases productivity and lowers the cost. This idea of specialization became one of the most important drivers of the modern economic thought. So now, moving on to the 19th century, economists began to shift their focus from entire nations to individual decision-making. This shift led to what we call the marginal revolution, which laid the foundation for modern microeconomics. Key thinkers such as William Stanley Jevons, Karl Menger, and Leon Walras argued that value of goods does not simply come from the labor used to produce them. However, value depends on how useful or satisfying the good is to the consumer, the concept known as utility. More importantly, they introduced the idea of marginal thinking. People don't usually decide based on the total benefit of something, but on the benefit of one additional unit. Like, for example, just imagine that you're very thirsty right now, and the first bottle of water gonna give you a lot of satisfaction. The second bottle of water still feels good, but actually a little less. By the third or the fourth bottle of water, the extra satisfaction becomes smaller and smaller. This idea called the law of diminishing marginal utility, meaning that each additional unit we consume usually gives us less extra satisfaction than the previous one. This concept becomes fundamental for understanding how people make everyday decisions, right? One another important classical economics is Say's law, proposed by the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. I'm not sure if I read his name right or not. The core idea of Say's law is often summarized in only one sentence. Supply creates its own demand. So what does that mean? It means that when businesses produce goods and services, they also create incomes in the economy. For example, when a company produces products, it has to pay wages to the workers, rent to property owners, and benefits to entrepreneurs. These incomes then give people the purchasing power to buy the goods and services that were produced. So production itself generates the demand needed to sustain the economy. According to this view, the widespread overproduction, where too many goods are produced and no one buys them, should not happen in the long run. If there's too much supplies, prices and wages will adjust, helping the market to move back to the balance before. This idea became a key foundation of classical macroeconomic thinking in the 19th century. While classical economics emphasized free markets and efficiency, the rapid expansion of the industrial capitalism in the 19th century also revealed serious social problems. And now we're moving on to the last phase, the third phase. During the Industrial Revolution, factories expanded very quickly, but working conditions are often extremely harsh. Many workers had to work in very long hours in unsafe environments, and even children were employed in factories. At the same time, wealth became increasingly concentrated among factory owners and industrial capitalists, while many workers remained trapped in poverty. This growing gap between rich and working class created a very strong social tensions across industrial societies. As inequality and dissatisfaction increased, some thinkers began to question whether the capitalist system was truly fair or sustainable. One of the most influential critics was Karl Marx, whose idea would form the foundation of the Marxist critics of capitalism. To understand the Marxist critics, we need to look at one of the key ideas developed by Karl Marx in his book called Das Kapital, which is the labor theory of value over here. And according to Marx, the value of a product mainly comes from the labor required to produce it. In other words, what really creates wealth in the society is human work. Marx argued that the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time, meaning that the average amount of time it normally takes worker using common skills and technology to produce that product. Like, for example, if it typically takes one worker 1 hour to produce a pair of shoes, so that labor time becomes the basis of that values. Meanwhile, machines or raw materials and capital do not create new value by themselves. They simply transfer the value that already created by labor into new products. To further develop his critics, Karl Marx introduced another central concept called surplus value. Marx argued that when workers produce goods, the value they create is often greater than the wages that they receive. Wages only compensate the necessary labor, the portion needed for the worker to survive and continue working. However, the remaining unpaid labor, which Marx called as surplus value, is captured by the capitalist as profit. From this perspective, exploitation is not simply about unfair individuals, but also the structure of capitalist system where owners control the means of production. Marx also believed that capitalism contains internal contradictions that may eventually destabilize the system, which is shown over here. First, wealth tends to become increasingly concentrated among a small group of capitalists. Second, capitalism might experience crisis of overproduction, where factories produce more goods than workers can afford to buy because the wages remain relatively low. Finally, this economic tension leads to class struggle between two major groups, the bourgeoisie, who own the means of production, and the proletariat, the workers who solve their labor. Over time, Marx believed that working class would develop class consciousness and eventually challenge the capitalist system itself. And to summarize the historical development of economic thought, we can see how each stage responded to the challenges of its time. In the late 18th century, Adam Smith and classical liberalism emphasized the invisible hand, arguing that free markets and specialization generate wealth. And in the early 19th century, Jean Pasteur proposed Say's law, suggesting that supply naturally creates demands and markets tend to self-correct. However, by the mid-19th century, Karl Marx challenged this optimistic view through the concept of surplus value. He argued that capitalism leads to worker exploitation and class conflicts. And finally, in the late 19th century, economists such as William Stanley Jevons and Karl Menger introduced the marginal revolution, proposing that economic values is subjective and depends on marginal utility. And together, these perspectives show how economic thought evolves through debate and critics, which is also the end of the sharing today. Thank you for watching the video, and just remember to watch the next video of Unista Business Club next week. Goodbye!